Hey guys, welcome back to another quiet dive into the strange side of human history. So, dim your lights, get comfortable, and maybe let the cat take your spot for a bit. Because tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. A time when justice was, well, creative. If you ever thought getting a parking ticket was bad, just wait until you hear what happened to people for stealing bread in the 13th century. Spoiler, it usually involved pain, humiliation, and sometimes a pig. Now, the Middle Ages were a long stretch of time, roughly 1,000 years of confusion, kings, plagues, and some deeply questionable hygiene. And when it came to punishment, people back then didn't really believe in subtlety. You didn't just learn your lesson, you became the lesson. So, let's float back to that world for a bit. The sound of distant church bells, the smell of wood smoke, and the quiet certainty that if you said the wrong thing about your local lord, you might lose an ear before lunch, the logic of medieval justice. First, let's get one thing out of the way. Medieval punishments weren't necessarily about fairness. They were more like a public service announcement, part moral lesson, part entertainment, and part stress relief for everyone watching. You know, a bit like early reality TV. The local authorities loved to make an example out of someone because the fear of punishment worked better than actual policing. There weren't CCTV cameras or forensics. If someone stole your chicken, your best bet was to start yelling and hope someone saw them. So the church and the crown had to get creative. They wanted people to behave, but also to stay terrified enough not to ask too many questions. And that's where things got interesting. Trial by ordeal. The original God will sort it out. One of the most bizarre concepts from the Middle Ages was trial by ordeal. It was exactly what it sounds like. A legal process that basically said, we have no idea who's guilty, so let's just ask God. If you were accused of a crime, you might have to plunge your hand into boiling water and pull out a stone from the bottom. If your hand healed cleanly over the next few days, congratulations, you were innocent. If it got infected, well, maybe that's just divine justice. There was also the ordeal by hot iron, where you carried a burning piece of metal for a few steps. Again, same logic. If you healed nicely, God liked you. If not, better luck next time in purgatory. And of course, my personal favourite, the ordeal by water. This one involved being tied up and thrown into a pond or river. If you floated, you were guilty because the pure water of God had rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent. Unfortunately, you were also drowning. So it was kind of a lose-lose situation. But don't worry, sometimes they tied a rope around you so they could pull you out before you actually died. Sometimes, the humiliation Olympics. Not every punishment involved permanent injury. Some were just deeply embarrassing. The Middle Ages had a thing for public humiliation. They believed shame was a great motivator. And honestly, they weren't wrong. There was the pillory, a wooden frame that held your head and hands so everyone could stare at you. You'd stand there for hours while people threw rotten food, mud, and occasionally rocks. It was basically the medieval version of a comment section, loud, mean, and oddly satisfying for the crowd. Then there was the ducking stool, usually reserved for disorderly women or supposed witches. The accused was strapped to a chair attached to a long wooden beam, then dunked repeatedly into a pond. The logic was unclear. Maybe to test if she was possessed. Maybe to just shut her up for a bit. Either way, people gathered to watch. It was a social event. Imagine your entire town showing up to see someone get dunked like a biscuit. There were probably snacks involved. Weirdly specific punishments. Now medieval folks didn't stop at generic punishments. Oh no, they loved creativity. Some crimes came with punishments so oddly specific that you could tell someone had way too much time to think them up. For example, in 1386, a pig in France was put on trial for killing a child. Yes, an actual pig. Witnesses were called. A lawyer defended the pig. In the end, the pig was found guilty and hanged in the town square, while dressed in human clothes, because apparently that was part of the justice system. It might sound ridiculous now, but to medieval people, it made perfect sense. They genuinely believed animals could be morally responsible. Cats, dogs, horses, pigs, all could be accused of crimes and punished like humans. One donkey even got off with an official pardon after a local priest testified that she had a good character. So, yes, there were animal trials, and sometimes they even won. Another bizarre case comes from 15th century Germany, where bakers who cheated customers by selling underweight bread were put in a special iron cage and dunked into a river. If they survived, they probably baked better bread after that. In the same spirit, but slightly less soggy, some cities forced dishonest merchants to parade through town with the products they had cheated on, wearing them like a costume. If you watered down your wine, you might be made to carry barrels of it on your back while everyone jeered. Medieval justice had a clear theme: humiliation first, logic later. The theatre of punishment, public executions, weren't just about getting rid of criminals. They were full-blown events. Townspeople gathered in the square, vendors sold food, and sometimes musicians played. Kids were there, dogs were there. It was a day out. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, each had its own style, and people had favourites. If that sounds morbid, remember, entertainment options were limited. There was no Netflix. Watching someone get publicly punished was, well, the medieval equivalent of catching the new episode of your favourite show. Executioners even became local celebrities. A good one was respected for making things quick and clean. A bad one could be booed or attacked if they botched it. Talk about workplace pressure. Punishments for nobles, because even kings messed up. Now, if you were rich or noble, your punishment usually came with a side of luxury. Instead of getting tortured or humiliated, you might just be exiled to a nice castle with a steady food supply and your own servants. The logic was that noble blood shouldn't be stained by physical punishment, but sometimes even royals couldn't escape creative justice. Take Charles the Bold of Burgundy. He was once so cruel to his subjects that they literally refused to help him in battle later on. Not an official punishment, but probably worse. Then there's Henry VIII, who basically turned execution into a personal hobby. When he got bored or paranoid, someone lost their head. His wives, his friends, his advisors, no one was safe. Technically, Henry didn't get punished, but if karma counts, well, he died bloated, paranoid, and ulcerous. Medieval justice moves slowly, and that's where we'll leave things for now. We've dipped our toes, gently, into the strange pond of medieval justice. Next time, we'll drift further into the punishments that went beyond bizarre, into the ones that were so specific, you can't help but wonder if the judge was having a bad day. Let's float there slowly in the next part. Part 2. The Tools of Pain and Piety. Hey again. If you're still here, cozy under a blanket, maybe halfway asleep, let's keep floating through the strange logic of medieval punishment. Last time, we talked about trials by ordeal and people getting dunked in ponds for justice. Tonight, things get mildly worse. Not horror movie bad, just medieval bad. Because once you start digging through the history of punishments, you realize something simple. Humans have always been a little too creative when they're angry, religious, or bored. The Church, the original legal influencer. Let's start with the big player in medieval justice, the Church. You might think priests were all about forgiveness, but medieval religion had this fun little twist. Punishment was also good for your soul. The idea was that suffering could purify you. If you were whipped, starved, or humiliated, that meant you were getting closer to God, because apparently nothing says redemption like public flagellation in front of your neighbours. So, instead of jail time, the Church often gave people spiritual chores. You might be sentenced to walk barefoot to a shrine hundreds of miles away, or to stand outside the cathedral wearing nothing but a sheet, confessing your sins out loud while people toss things at you. Pilgrimage became a sort of travelling punishment. You could commit a sin, then get a get-out-of-purgatory ticket by walking for 6 months across Europe, usually with blisters, rain and questionable food. There were also self-punishments. People whipped themselves in religious processions, believing each lash burned away sin. Entire movements formed around it, like the flagellants, who roamed from town to town during the Black Death, beating themselves to atone for humanity's sins. If that sounds intense, it's because it was. But it was also weirdly popular. People came to watch, pray, and sometimes join in. It was public guilt as group therapy, torture, the scientific side of justice or right. Let's talk about the part everyone secretly expects in a medieval story, torture. But before your mind jumps to iron maidens and spiked chairs, let's get something straight. Most of those fancy devices you see in museums, they're either exaggerated or straight up made later for tourists. The real medieval torture was simpler, and somehow worse for that reason. The main idea was to get a confession. Whether or not you were actually guilty wasn't as important as whether you eventually admitted you were. The Church loved a confession. It made the paperwork cleaner, so they had a few reliable methods. There was the strappado, where your hands were tied behind your back and you were hoisted into the air by a rope. Sometimes they dropped you suddenly to dislocate your shoulders. It was quick, effective, and left very little blood, so you could still be presented in court later looking intact. Then there was the rack, a simple wooden frame that stretched your body inch by inch. You confessed before your limbs came off, usually around the time your bones started making interesting noises. And, for good measure, the thumbscrew. Exactly what it sounds like. Metal clamps crushed your fingers or toes. Portable, efficient, and great for private interrogations. All of this sounds horrifying now, but at the time it was just procedure. No one thought of it as evil. It was just part of the system, like filling out forms. And in a twisted way, it was honourable. If you confessed, your soul could still be saved before execution. So, torture wasn't just cruelty. It was considered mercy. The logic really was, better you suffer now than forever in hell. The public spectacle. But torture wasn't only done in dark dungeons. Sometimes it was proudly public. In 14th century France, heretics were paraded through the streets carrying candles before being burned. In England, traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered, literally taken apart in front of cheering crowds. And again, this wasn't considered strange. It was civic entertainment. People dressed up. Vendors sold food. Sometimes the condemned gave speeches to the crowd. There's a record of one man in Paris joking as he was about to be burned. He said, "You'll all be warm today thanks to me." The crowd laughed. Then he burned. Medieval humor was complicated. The creative punishments. Then there were punishments that didn't quite fit any category. The ones that feel more like performance art than justice. Take the cucking stool, for instance. Not to be confused with the ducking stool. The cucking stool was stationary. A chair placed in the town square where people accused of gossip or nagging were tied up and ridiculed. Sometimes they were made to wear ridiculous hats or signs describing their crime. Or the scold's bridle, a metal cage worn on the head with a tongue plate that prevented you from speaking. It was used mostly on women accused of being too opinionated. The symbolism wasn't subtle. There was also the drunkard's cloak, which was basically a barrel with holes cut out for the head and arms. If you were caught drunk in public, you gotta wear it and parade around town. Nothing sobers you up like being a walking wine cask. And then there's my favorite, the shame flute. Used in parts of Germany, it was a metal instrument that didn't actually play. It locked around your neck and wrists, so it looked like you were holding a flute. It was reserved for bad musicians or noisy troublemakers. So yes, if you played terribly, you could be sentenced to wear a fake flute in public. The Middle Ages took their music seriously. These punishments tell you a lot about medieval life. They weren't just about control. They were about order, noise, and reputation. Towns were small. Everyone knew everyone. So the fear of humiliation worked better than prison bars. The executioner's joblets float over to a figure who fascinated everyone but was never invited to dinner. The executioner. Being an executioner was a strange career. It was well paid but socially toxic. You couldn't live near normal people, and you often had to marry within your own profession because no one else would have you. Yet, ironically, towns depended on them. They were necessary for justice to function, and a skilled executioner could become almost respected. The best ones were known for precision. A single, clean stroke with the sword, and the condemned died instantly. A bad executioner could take multiple swings, and the crowd would boo. There are records of executioners being attacked or killed by angry spectators if they botched the job. In some places, executioners were allowed to take the clothes or possessions of the condemned as part of their pay. Others had the right to sell body parts for medical research, or witchcraft ingredients depending on the local economy. A few even developed public followings. In Nuremberg, the famous executioner Franz Schmidt kept detailed journals of his work. He saw himself as a civil servant, not a monster. His notes read like quiet bureaucratic poetry. Executed Hans Meyer, thief with the rope, confessed fully. May God forgive him. He executed over 300 people in his career and retired peacefully, later becoming a respected healer because apparently medieval Europe was fine with someone spending 40 years cutting off heads and then switching to medicine. Career flexibility, the irony of mercy medieval justice did, at times, show mercy, at least by its own definition. For example, nobles sentenced to death were usually beheaded because it was faster and more honourable. Commoners might be hanged or burned instead. In some rare cases, executions were symbolic, like when someone important had to be punished, but no one wanted to kill them outright. So they'd perform a sort of fake execution or exile them to a monastery instead. There's a story about a noble who was condemned to death, but at the last minute, his sentence was changed to banishment. They made him watch the executioner swing anyway, just so he'd feel the fear. Then they told him to pack his bags, efficient trauma, medieval style, and if you were lucky or well connected, you could buy your way out of punishment entirely. Paying a fine to avoid mutilation was common. Justice, but make it economic. We'll drift further into this strange world next time. into the punishments that weren't just physical, but moral, where guilt, confession, and reputation mattered more than life itself. Because in medieval Europe, sometimes the worst punishment wasn't pain, it was shame that followed you for the rest of your life. Part 3: The weight of shame and sin. Hey again. If you're still awake, welcome back. If you're half asleep, that's perfectly fine too. This is, after all, boring history on purpose. Last time, we drifted through the creative torture methods and questionable logic of medieval justice. Tonight, let's slow down a bit. We're leaving the torture chambers and heading into the quieter side of punishment. The kind that didn't always leave scars on the body, but definitely lingered in the mind. Because in the Middle Ages, sometimes, the worst thing that could happen to you wasn't being beaten or stretched. It was being noticed, being labelled a sinner, a liar, a gossip, or worse, a heretic. And in a world where reputation meant survival, shame could destroy you more efficiently than any sword. The theatre of reputation, life in a medieval town was crowded. People lived shoulder to shoulder. Gossip moved faster than mail, and privacy didn't exist. Everyone knew who was sleeping with whom, who owed the baker money, and who skipped church last Sunday. And because your reputation was your social credit, public punishment became a sort of medieval PR campaign. If someone was found guilty of adultery, blasphemy, or even laziness, they might be paraded through the town square wearing some form of symbolic costume, like animal skins or a sign listing their crime. There were punishments for everything. Gossiped too much, you might be forced to walk around with a stone in your mouth, a symbolic way of saying, "I'll keep quiet now." Stole a loaf of bread, you could be branded on the hand. Lied under oath, you might lose your tongue, because subtlety was not a medieval strong point. But sometimes, humiliation wasn't about crime at all, it was about control. Town authorities used these punishments to remind everyone that the system was always watching. Even a rumour could ruin you. If someone accused you of witchcraft, for instance, there might not be any proof, but the stain of the accusation was enough. People would avoid you, refuse to trade with you, whisper when you passed by. It was a slow kind of social death, and because everyone feared being the next target, no one defended you. The church's quiet grip. The church's reach extended far beyond spiritual guidance. It was the ultimate moral authority. It didn't just decide who got into heaven, it decided who could live peacefully on earth. Sin and crime were often treated as the same thing. Adultery wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. Missing Sunday Mass wasn't just lazy, it was suspicious, and confession wasn't optional, it was expected. If a priest decided you were guilty of something, you could be sentenced to fasting, pilgrimage, or wearing a visible mark of penance, like a coloured patch sewn onto your clothing. For weeks or months, everyone would know you had sinned. Some people took this further, embracing public repentance as a way to cleanse themselves completely. They'd walk barefoot through towns, crying and begging forgiveness, often wearing chains. It was part theatre, part spirituality, and part social rehabilitation. Because the church didn't just punish, it also gave the only route to redemption. Refuse to confess, and you were seen as defiant. Confess too eagerly, and you were suspect. It was a delicate balance, like trying to survive in a world where your thoughts were public property. Punishments of silence. Some medieval penalties were remarkably quiet. No blood, no shouting crowds, just exile, exclusion, and silence. If you angered your lord, your neighbours, or your church, you might simply be banished. sometimes from your village, sometimes from the entire kingdom. It sounds almost peaceful until you remember how dependent people were on their communities. Being cast out meant losing everything: your trade, your friends, your home, your protection. You weren't just alone, you were vulnerable. Even worse was excommunication. That was the church's ultimate weapon, cutting you off not just socially, but spiritually. It meant you couldn't attend mass, marry, be buried in consecrated ground, or even receive food from your neighbors without them risking their own damnation. It was social death, dressed in theology, and people feared it more than any physical pain. You could survive being whipped. You could survive the stocks, but to die outside God's grace, that was the real horror. Everyday fear, laws of morality. The medieval world wasn't divided neatly between crime and sin. The two were hopelessly tangled. Moral laws reached into everyday life. If you ate meat on a Friday, you could be fined. If you wore clothes considered too luxurious for your social class, you might be stripped of them in public. And if you cursed or blasphemed, you could lose your tongue or at least pay a fine to remind you that God had heard. This obsession with morality created a strange kind of social tension. Everyone was policing everyone else. Your neighbor's behavior could affect your reputation. Your friend's sin could bring down your business. So people spied, reported, and whispered. It's hard to call that justice, but in its own way, it kept things stable. Fear of judgment, by law, by God, by gossip, was the glue that held society together. Public penance. The stage of the guilty, public penance ceremonies were the Middle Ages' way of saying, yes, you messed up, but at least you're doing it with style. These events often happened during Lent or major church feasts. When the whole town gathered, the guilty would walk barefoot, sometimes wearing only a shift, carrying candles or crosses, confessing their sins aloud. The priest would pronounce forgiveness, but the humiliation would linger. Everyone remembered who had walked, and the next time that person got into trouble, the whispers would start again. Didn't he already repent last year? It was a loop of shame and redemption that could last a lifetime. In some places, they made a distinction between private and public sinners. Private sin could be confessed quietly. Public sin demanded public display. So if your scandal was juicy enough to spread through town, congratulations. You just earned yourself a community performance. And if you refused to participate, you were considered beyond saving, which was ironically worse. Crime and punishment in everyday life. Not all punishments were religious or political. Some were just local improvisations, neighbours settling scores with community approval. In small villages, a thief might be forced to return stolen goods while crawling on hands and knees. A dishonest blacksmith might have his tools destroyed, and a cheating baker could be locked in a cage and dunked in water because apparently soggy bread jokes never got old. Sometimes the crowd got involved. If someone insulted the town or disrespected local customs, people might perform a charivari, a noisy, mocking parade. They'd bang pots, shout insults, and follow the person around until they left or apologized. It wasn't official justice, but it worked. Public embarrassment was cheaper than jail, and in some ways, this kind of informal punishment kept things from boiling over into violence. Everyone got to participate. Everyone felt like they'd done their civic duty. It was noisy, petty, and deeply human. The paradox of pain and piety. The deeper you go into medieval punishment, the more you see the contradictions. They talked about mercy, but practiced cruelty. They preached forgiveness, but thrived on public shame. They feared sin, yet obsessed over describing it in detail, and through it all, people adapted. They learned to play the system, to confess strategically, to bribe officials, to fake repentance when necessary. Because even in the Middle Ages, justice wasn't really blind. It squinted, listened to gossip, and occasionally took a bribe. So as we drift further into the candlelight of this strange era, you can start to see the pattern. Medieval punishment wasn't really about the crime. It was about power, spiritual, social, and emotional. A world where being forgiven meant being humiliated, and being silent meant survival. Next time, we'll ease into part 4, where we'll explore how the nobility and monarchs twisted justice for personal gain, how kings used punishment as theatre, popes used it as politics, and peasants learned to endure it all in silence. Part 4. Royals, egos, and the theatre of justice. Hey there, still with me? If you're cozy enough to make it this far, congratulations. You're officially halfway into drifting through the mildly depressing but oddly fascinating world of medieval punishments. So far, we've covered the common folk, the dunking chairs, the pillories, the shameful costumes, and the public penances. Tonight, we're gliding over to the other end of the spectrum, the elites. Kings, queens, and nobles had a whole different set of rules, and unsurprisingly, they were just as bizarre. Because in the Middle Ages, justice wasn't just about punishing. It was about performance, power, and ego, the royal toolbox. If you were a peasant, your punishment was usually physical or humiliating. If you were a noble, your punishment was strategic, symbolic, or theatrical. Kings used punishment like an expensive accessory. They didn't want to destroy their peers. They wanted to remind them who was in charge. Take, for example, Edward II of England. He had a reputation for being delicate in ways that made his nobles nervous. When he angered someone, he didn't get thrown in the stocks. Instead, they staged political theatre, stripping him of power, locking him away in comfortable quarters, and forcing him to watch as his allies were exiled or executed. Psychological punishment, modern medieval style. Then there was Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. He had episodes where he thought he was made of glass. Literally. He wore reinforced clothing to avoid shattering. Nobles had to tiptoe around him. Some historians suggest that fear of his episodes became a form of social control. If you knew the king could snap at any moment, you were careful about asking for favours. His punishment for the court was anxiety. Royal punishments were often symbolic. If someone displeased the king, he might strip them of titles, banish them to a distant castle, or force them into humiliating service, like carrying his train during ceremonies. It was less about pain and more about status correction. Monarchs as performers in many ways. Kings turned justice into theatre. Public trials of nobles were common. These events weren't just legal proceedings. They were spectacles, choreographed to display royal authority. A convicted noble might be required to ride through the city wearing a symbolic costume, like a fool's outfit, or parade with a guilty sign. Sometimes they were made to apologize publicly, while the king's advisors recited their crimes. And, of course, there was the subtle art of delayed punishment. A king could announce a sentence, let months or years pass, and then carry it out suddenly. This created anxiety and reinforced power. The crown also had another favourite, economic punishment. Fine someone into bankruptcy, seize property, forced them to pay enormous sums for the crime of being out of favour. It was low risk for the monarch, high stress for the victim, and excellent theatre for the court. Royal oddities, creative or cruel. Some royal punishments were, well, let's call them inventive. Peter of Castile, known as Peter the Cruel, liked to exile or execute nobles based on whim, but he also had a flair for performance. One noble was executed with the king personally reading the charges aloud, then allowing the condemned to speak in defense before being killed. A show of mercy wrapped in terror. Then there's King John of England, famous for signing the Magna Carta, but also for punishing enemies creatively. He would sometimes imprison barons for years, feeding them just enough to survive, or demand ransom while keeping them in near solitary confinement. And of course we can't forget Louis XV of France, who reportedly kept a secret room where he would hold and psychologically torment nobles he distrusted. There were no chains, just isolation, darkness, and the occasional interrogator asking the same questions for hours. Torture of the mind, subtle, slow, and exhausting. Punishments as politics. Royal punishment wasn't just about morality or law, it was a political tool. Take the Tower of London. Sure, it was a prison, but it was also a statement. You could hold a royal rival there in relative comfort, or starve them. The very sight of someone imprisoned in the tower sent a clear message. We control you, your friends, and your reputation. Kings also manipulated punishments to send messages to neighbours. Executing a traitor publicly wasn't just about the crime. It was a warning to anyone else who might think of rebellion. Sometimes the punishments themselves were designed to humiliate without killing. A baron might be forced to kneel before the king while peasants spat at him, or a queen might be confined to her chambers, only allowed visitors at the king's discretion. These punishments reinforced hierarchy. The crown's power wasn't just physical, it was psychological, eccentric personal punishments. Some monarchs got, oddly specific Charles VI of France, again had nobles punished for minor offences with symbolic objects like forcing them to carry a pig through the streets if accused of gluttony. Henry VIII occasionally fined nobles absurd amounts of money for imagined slights, or forced them to perform humiliating acts at court banquets. Because why not mix punishment with dinner entertainment? And then there's Empress Matilda's enemies, who, when captured, were sometimes made to wear humiliating hats or collars in public. The symbolism was clear. You may have wealth or rank, but if you cross me, you will parade like a fool. These punishments were deeply theatrical. Pain wasn't always necessary. Embarrassment could be just as effective. The blurring lines by now, it's obvious that medieval justice had fuzzy edges. Pain and humiliation could overlap. Political power could masquerade as morality. Public spectacle was often the point. A noble could suffer without physical harm. A peasant could be humiliated for life for a minor theft. Kings could be terrifying without ever touching anyone. It's all part of the same system, controlling people through fear, shame, and performance. And for the medieval mind, it worked. Closing thoughts for tonight. So as we drift to sleep under the candlelight of history, consider this. Medieval punishment wasn't just about crime. It was about reminding everyone of their place, keeping the social order, and entertaining the masses. The tools changed. Sticks, ropes, stocks, or just a sharply worded proclamation. But the goal stayed the same. Control, order, and a little bit of spectacle. And with that, we'll float gently into part 5, where we'll explore the most bizarre and oddly specific punishments. given to the common folk, the kind that make you wonder how someone even thought of them in the first place. Part 5. Peculiar punishments. For the common folk, hey again, if you're still listening or slowly drifting off, welcome back. Tonight, we're zooming in on the commoners, the peasants, bakers and blacksmiths who didn't get royal courts or fancy exile, just the full creative force of local justice. Because while nobles got theatre, common folk got inventiveness. And by inventiveness, I mean punishments that were sometimes cruel, sometimes ridiculous, and often both. Guilds and crafty punishments. Medieval towns weren't just about kings and nobles. They were about trades. Craftsmen, bakers and blacksmiths had strict guild rules. Break the rules, and you didn't just face fines. You faced humiliation in front of your peers. Bakers, for example, could be fined for selling underweight bread. But some towns went further. Bakers caught cheating were sometimes placed in a cage and hung in the town square, sometimes dunked in water if the crime was severe enough. Humiliation plus public demonstration. Guaranteed lesson. Tailors and cobblers had their own punishments. If they cheated customers, they might have to wear their own defective work as clothing while walking through the streets. Imagine a cobbler walking in shoes with holes in the soles. Humiliation and advertisement combined. Even more creatively, some guilds used public apologies, where the offender would kneel in the square, confess their wrongdoing aloud, and promise never to repeat it. This was usually accompanied by jeering, shouting, or being pelted with rotten fruit. Humiliation was cheap, and it was effective. People remembered your mistake for years. Fines and forfeitures, money mattered, and fines were sometimes more entertaining than effective. Steal a chicken, pay triple in coins or chickens depending on the town, accidentally insult a neighbour. You might have to provide beer at the next feast, offend the wrong local official. The fine could include wearing a ridiculous costume, sometimes even a papier-mâché animal mask, while performing your public apology. Some towns got very creative. In parts of Germany, people caught fighting were made to fight again, this time dressed in ridiculous outfits while being jeered at by townspeople. The spectacle wasn't intended to injure. It was intended to shame and entertain. Even small moral infractions had consequences. People caught gossiping, being drunk, or skipping church could be fined, publicly shamed, or forced to perform acts of service like cleaning the streets in front of everyone. Odd fines weren't always monetary. Sometimes they were symbolic. A woman caught nagging might be forced to wear a bridle or metal mask, known as a scold's bridle, for hours or even days. Villagers caught fighting might have to march with a broom, sweeping the streets to symbolize peacekeeping. People who cursed excessively could be forced to carry a stone in their mouth for a set distance. These punishments were oddly poetic in their symbolism. You were literally carrying your sin. You were wearing it. Everyone could see it. The ducking stool and water-based punishments. We mentioned these before, but let's linger a little. The ducking stool wasn't just for witches. Women accused of gossiping, arguing or nagging could be strapped in and dunked in a river or pond, repeatedly. Sometimes this happened in front of the whole town. It was effective as humiliation, and also as a cautionary tale. If you didn't behave, everyone knew exactly what might happen. Men could face similar punishments, though usually for more serious crimes, like fraud or theft. Sometimes the offender was dunked while tied to a chair or plank, or forced to hold their head underwater briefly. Even small towns loved water-based spectacle. Rivers, ponds, and wells became instruments of discipline. Humiliation in costumes were everywhere in medieval punishment. People might be made to wear signs describing their crime. Fools, clowns, or animals were sometimes incorporated into the outfit. A thief could be forced to parade through town in chains, wearing a heavy iron collar. Offenders accused of lying might have masks shaped like animals that symbolize their perceived character. Pigs for gluttony, donkeys for stupidity, crows for gossip. The symbolism was intentional. The goal was to etch your crime into public memory, sometimes for years. Community involvement village punishments often involved the community. People didn't just watch, they participated. Crowds threw rotten vegetables, stones or mud. Children followed offenders around, mimicking and shouting insults. Neighbors laughed, shamed, and reminded the offender of their misdeed. In a way, punishment was as much about teaching the town as disciplining the individual. It reinforced social norms, moral behavior, and obedience to authority. The catch: everyone could be a participant, and everyone could eventually be a victim. No one was exempt from this system of constant observation and judgment. Religious overtones, even for commoners. Punishment often had a spiritual angle. Fasting, pilgrimages, or wearing penitential garments could be ordered alongside public humiliation. Missing church, lying under oath, or minor blasphemy could result in fines or tasks designed to make your sin visible. Sometimes, offenders were forced to pray publicly, recite penitential psalms, or carry candles to shrines. The aim wasn't just justice, it was spiritual correction. You were being punished in body, soul, and reputation all at once. Minor crimes, major embarrassment, even the smallest crimes could lead to dramatic punishment. Boy caught stealing apples might be tied to a post wearing a basket on his head. A drunken man could be paraded with a bottle tied around his neck, so everyone knew who he was. Someone caught cheating at dice might have to play the next game in chains while being laughed at. Medieval people had a flair for taking small transgressions and turning them into full-blown public theatre. Closing thoughts for tonight, and that's the world of common folk punishments. Humiliating, symbolic, and strangely poetic in their cruelty. They weren't just about enforcing the law, they were about teaching, entertaining, and controlling. Physical pain was optional. Shame was mandatory. As we drift slowly to part 6, we'll explore even more extremes. The instruments of punishment themselves, the myths versus reality of torture devices, and some of the most absurd contraptions ever designed by medieval ingenuity. Part 6. Instruments of pain and ingenious devices. Hey again. If you're still cozy and listening, welcome back. Tonight, we drift further into the mechanical side of medieval punishment. The devices, contraptions, and innovations designed to enforce law, morality, and occasionally public amusement, because by now, you've seen that medieval justice wasn't just about human creativity. It extended to the tools they made to carry it out. Torture devices. Myth versus reality. When people think of medieval torture, the mind often jumps to Iron Maidens, spiked chairs, or stretching racks. But let's clarify. Many of those devices were exaggerated later, sometimes centuries after the fact. Still, that doesn't mean medieval engineers weren't inventive. They just used simpler, brutal, or cleverly humiliating methods. Take the rack, for example. It was a wooden frame with ropes attached to your wrists and ankles. As the executioner turned the wheel, your body stretched painfully. It was effective because it caused extreme discomfort without necessarily killing you, and of course, it encouraged confessions. Then there was the strappado, a method of suspension. Your hands tied behind your back, you were hoisted into the air. sometimes dropped to dislocate your shoulders, efficient, dramatic, and perfect for extracting information. The thumbscrew was smaller, but just as effective. A simple metal clamp gradually crushing fingers or toes. Portable, discreet, and a favourite for local interrogations. Other devices were more theatrical than practical, designed to frighten, humiliate, or impress the crowd. The Iron Maiden and medieval myth are the Iron Maiden, often pictured as a spiked sarcophagus ready to impale its victim. Modern historians suggest that many Iron Maidens were either later inventions or exaggerations of actual torture devices. Why the myth? People love imagining horrifying medieval brutality, but real punishments were often more immediate, more direct, and sometimes less spectacular than we think. Still, the fear factor was real. The mere rumour of a device could cause panic, ensuring obedience without ever needing to use it. Devices of humiliation. Not every tool was about physical pain. Many were about shame. The pillory, a wooden frame locking your head and hands, leaving you exposed to the town's jeers and projectiles. The stocks, similar to the pillory, but for your feet, sometimes combined with the pillory for full-body embarrassment. The cucking stool. Women accused of nagging, gossip, or moral infractions would be strapped to a chair and dunked in water repeatedly. These tools were inexpensive, effective, and served as public morality lessons. Pain wasn't always the point, visibility was. Specialized contraptions, some devices were oddly specific. Medieval ingenuity sometimes reached levels of bizarre creativity. The scold's bridle, or branks, a metal cage for the head with a tongue plate preventing speech, mostly used on women accused of being too outspoken. Symbolism. Silence the gossip. Maintains social order. Drunkard's cloak. A barrel worn by someone caught drunk in public, forcing them to parade while humiliated. Shame flute. A metal apparatus meant to make you look like you were playing a flute. For noisy or disruptive offenders. All of these were cheap, portable, and highly visible. The idea was the same. Shame works where fear alone may not. Instruments of death. Some devices were intended for executions, but again, not always as flashy as Hollywood suggests. Hanging. Simple, effective, and reserved for commoners. Beheading, reserved for nobles. Quick, clean, and honourable. Burning at the stake, often used for heretics or those condemned by the church. The fire symbolized purification. Execution devices were designed to enforce hierarchy. Nobles died cleanly, commoners suffered more visibly. Other devices were built to delay death just long enough for public spectacle. Executioners sometimes had a flair for precision. A good one made it swift. A bad one could provoke the crowd's wrath. Imagination meets law. Medieval punishment combined practicality, spectacle, and theatricality. Physical tools ensured compliance. Humiliation enforced social hierarchy. Public displays reminded everyone of the consequences of disobedience. And sometimes, devices were playful, at least in concept. People wore animal masks, signs, or ridiculous costumes. Tools became symbols. Justice wasn't just law, it was performance art. The key principle: make the offender visible, memorable, and symbolic. Case studies: ingenious devices in action. The ducking stool. More than a chair in water, it was a warning. Entire communities watched. Repeated dunking served both punishment and entertainment. The brank. Women accused of scandal or gossip could not speak. Their crime became visible, tangible, and unforgettable. The pillory combined with mockery, Offenders might wear animal heads, signs, or costumes, combining public shaming with humor. Another layer of societal control. Each device carried social, psychological, and moral weight. Pain alone wasn't enough. Humiliation amplified the lesson. Closing thoughts for tonight. As we slowly drift to sleep with our thoughts on medieval inventions, remember this: the tools themselves tell a story. Pain and shame were intertwined. Visibility mattered more than blood in many cases. Creativity wasn't reserved for art. It went into control. Next time, in part 7, we'll glide into the slightly more human side again. The psychology behind punishment. Why people complied. Why shame was so effective. And how fear shaped daily life for both peasants and nobles. Part 7. Fear, shame, and the psychology of punishment. Hey again. If you're still with me, or gently nodding off, welcome back. Tonight, we step away from the physical devices and dive into the human side of medieval justice. The psychology behind it all, how fear, shame, and social pressure shaped behavior, and why punishments were so effective even when they didn't hurt. Because by the 14th century, medieval societies realized something obvious. You don't always need chains or whips. Sometimes the mind is the best instrument of control. Fear as a tool in medieval towns and courts. Fear was everywhere. Fear of physical pain, whipping, dunking, mutilation. Fear of social humiliation, stocks, branks, public parades. Fear of divine wrath, excommunication, denial of sacraments, or the threat of eternal damnation. All of these operated simultaneously. A peasant might fear the executioner, but the shame of the pillory could linger for years. A noble might fear political exile, but the potential gossip and rumor could be far more damaging. And because everyone lived in small communities, word traveled fast. One bad deed could ruin your reputation, career, and marriage prospects. Fear worked better than any prison wall because everyone was watching. Shame as a social weapon. Shame wasn't just punishment. It was a way to enforce moral codes. Gossipers, nags, and liars were humiliated publicly. Offenders were forced to wear symbols of their crime. Animal masks, signs, or ironic costumes. Repetition mattered. Being paraded repeatedly, dunked, or mocked embedded lessons in memory. Shame reinforced social norms in a way physical pain alone couldn't. Pain was temporary. Humiliation was permanent. Even the church understood this. Public confession, walking barefoot, or wearing penitential garments wasn't about hurting you physically. It was about making sin visible to all. The psychological effect was enormous. Obedience through observation. One fascinating aspect of medieval punishment. Surveillance was constant. Everyone observed everyone else. Gossip spread like wildfire. Fear of judgment influenced behavior more than laws themselves. You didn't have to be punished directly to be affected. Seeing your neighbor dunked in the pond or paraded in a cucking stool taught a lesson just as powerful as if it had happened to you. This is what historians call vicarious punishment. People learned through observation, internalizing rules without ever being physically harmed. Ritualized punishment. Many punishments were ceremonial, almost ritualistic. Public penance, confessing sins aloud, kneeling, walking barefoot, processions, carrying candles or crosses while townspeople watched, mock executions, staged events to frighten but not kill. These rituals reinforce societal hierarchy and morality. They taught participants humility, obedience, and respect for authority. Interestingly, the rituals often combined fear, shame, and spectacle in ways that were surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval authorities understood that punishment worked best when it engaged body, mind, and community. Psychological innovations. Some punishments were purely psychological. Isolation. Nobles or commoners confined alone for weeks, deprived of social contact. Mock executions, letting the condemned experience the terror without the finality. Social ostracism, refusal to trade, speak, or interact with someone guilty of minor offences. These methods exploited natural human fears, loneliness, anxiety, and social rejection. They didn't leave scars, but they were memorable. Even small villages mastered this. The charivari, where an offender was mocked with noise and spectacle, relied entirely on peer pressure and embarrassment. Pain wasn't necessary. The crowd's judgment was enough. The role of religion. Religion amplified psychological impact. Fear of divine punishment. Sin wasn't just socially dangerous, it endangered the soul. Excommunication, social exclusion and spiritual damnation combined. Confession, forced acknowledgement of guilt, often publicly, reinforced the offender's awareness of wrongdoing. Medieval people were deeply religious. The threat of eternal damnation added weight to even minor punishments. It also made people internalize rules. You didn't need a guard constantly watching you. Belief in God's gaze and the fear of communal shame ensured compliance. Compliance and control. By combining physical, psychological, and social pressure, medieval authorities created a remarkably effective system of control. Pain ensured obedience in the moment. Shame ensured long-term memory. Fear ensured preemptive compliance. Even nobles, with power and privilege, weren't immune. Royal punishments were often psychological. Exile, public humiliation, or symbolic acts reinforced hierarchy and loyalty without killing the subject. Commoners learned faster. A peasant who saw another dunked in a pond was unlikely to misbehave again. The system was, in its own way, efficient. Closing thoughts for tonight's. As we float towards sleep, remember, medieval punishment wasn't random. It was psychological engineering. Fear, shame, and social pressure maintained order in a world without modern police, surveillance, or prisons. Devices were tools, but human perception was the real instrument of control. Humiliation often mattered more than pain. Public rituals taught, reminded, and intimidated in equal measure. Part 8. Bizarre and Ironic Punishments. Hey again. If you're still with me or nodding slowly off, welcome back. Tonight, we're entering the world of the strangely clever, sometimes silly, and ironically humane punishments of the Middle Ages. Because after all, not every punishment was about pain. Some were about spectacle, irony, or just plain medieval creativity. The art of ironic punishment. Medieval societies loved irony. If someone stole a cow, why not make them parade around with a cowbell leading a cow? If someone lied under oath, why not make them wear a pig's snout, literally marking them as a liar? These punishments weren't just funny. They were lessons encoded in absurdity. They transformed crime into a story, a visual warning, and a memory that stuck. Animal-themed humiliation. Animals were a common motif. Pigs and donkeys, liars, gluttons, or fools were sometimes made to wear masks or sit on barrels shaped like animals. Goat parades. Villagers caught cheating or causing mischief might be forced to lead a goat through town, sometimes adorned with bells. Cages of birds. Some petty offenders were locked in small cages, like crows or other birds, to symbolize their petty nature. The humor was intentional. Offenders became walking metaphors of their crimes, both teaching and entertaining the community. Punishments for speech. The medieval world took speech seriously. Gossip, blasphemy, or excessive arguing could result in clever punishments. Scold's bridle, a metal cage for the head, preventing speech, often with a tongue plate. Women accused of being too outspoken were common targets. Dunce caps or masks. Men and women guilty of gossip or lying could be made to parade wearing a mask shaped like an animal or a pointed hat. Forced public apologies. Repeatedly confessing misdeeds in front of the town reinforced both shame and memory. Speech was dangerous in a world where rumor and reputation were everything. These punishments symbolically silenced the offender while entertaining the town. Odd physical punishments. Some punishments were strangely gentle, or at least non-lethal, but very memorable. Drunkard's cloak, a barrel worn in public, with the head and arms poking out, parading the offender through town. Whipping posts with feathers or soap. Mild pain paired with humiliation for petty crimes. Stockades with signs. The offender might sit in a pillory holding a sign stating the offence for hours. These punishments were cheap, visible, and highly effective at creating communal memory of the crime. Public participation. Punishment was rarely a private affair. Crowds threw rotten vegetables, shouted insults, or mocked offenders. This collective involvement reinforced moral norms. Charivari, noisy processions to shame people for marital infidelity or misbehavior. Mock processions. Offenders might be led through the streets with bells, hats, or costumes, while everyone jeered. Participation ensured the town absorbed the lesson, and everyone remembered the story of the crime for years. Punishments for minutiae. Some crimes seem laughable today, but were taken seriously back then. Wearing the wrong type of clothing for your social rank. Eating meat on a religious fast day. Minor quarrels or insults. The punishments matched the minor infractions, often through humiliation rather than pain, public apology, ridiculous costumes, or temporary loss of privileges. This approach was efficient. Small crimes didn't overwhelm courts, but the social lesson was enforced through visibility. Bizarre instruments, medieval ingenuity sometimes produced devices that seem comical today. The cucking stool or ducking stool, for women accused of nagging or gossiping, simple, watery, and theatrical. Shame flutes or masks. Devices turning minor infractions into walking spectacles. Animal masks and costumes. Symbolism applied liberally. Irony, spectacle, and moral education combined. The goal was never just pain. It was a lesson everyone could see. The human side of humor in punishment, even in the darkest corners of medieval justice, there was an awareness of human psychology. Humor softened outrage. Absurdity reinforced memory. Visibility ensured compliance. These punishments worked because humans are social creatures. Public shaming, irony, and ridicule tapped into the same instincts that gossip and reputation always have. Closing thoughts for tonight. So, as you drift closer to sleep, think about this. Medieval punishments weren't always brutal. They were smart. They leveraged human psychology, community pressure, and a little theatrical flair. Pain was optional, shame was permanent. And in a society with no police, no prisons, and no social media, human memory and observation were the real enforcers. Part 9. Legendary Cases and Extraordinary Punishments. Hey again. If you're still listening, or almost asleep, welcome back. Tonight, we drift into some of the more famous, peculiar, and sometimes absurd cases of medieval justice. Think of it as the greatest hits of humiliation, legal creativity, and public spectacle. These stories show just how imaginative or vindictive medieval authorities could be, and how the line between law, morality, and entertainment often blurred. The case of the man who stole apples. Our first story is simple but telling. A man in a small English village stole apples from the local orchard. The law didn't need to kill him, he wasn't a threat. Instead, the punishment was symbolic. He was forced to parade through the town wearing a basket on his head filled with the stolen apples. A sign declared his crime. Villagers jeered, threw mud, and followed him through the streets. This punishment had 3 goals: recovery, the apples were returned, public shaming, and moral education. The man suffered no lasting injury, but the embarrassment ensured no repeat offence and sent a clear lesson to everyone else. The infamous charivari of married. Couples charivaris weren't reserved. For minor theft, they could target marital misconduct. Adulterous or mismatched couples might be paraded through town with pots, pans, and noisemakers. Participants mocked, shouted, and threw vegetables. Sometimes, the offending partner wore a symbolic costume, like a donkey mask or a patched garment. The point wasn't cruelty, it was community enforcement of social norms. The ritual reminded everyone that behavior had consequences, and no one was above collective scrutiny. The drunkard's cloak, one of the more enduring images of ironic punishment, is the drunkard's cloak. A heavy barrel with holes for the head and arms forced the offender to march through town. The entire community watched, mocked, and remembered the crime. Sometimes it rained, sometimes it was summer. Either way, uncomfortable, public, and unforgettable. Medieval authorities understood that ridicule, combined with exposure, could be more effective than pain alone. The case of the baker's deception. Bakers were under strict guild rules. One baker, caught selling underweight bread, faced a theatrical punishment. He was forced to wear a bread bag around his neck with his crime inscribed. Public mockery accompanied his parade through the town square. If the offence was repeated, more creative humiliation awaited, including being dunked or fined heavily. Guilds combined economic enforcement with public spectacle. Cheating customers wasn't just immoral, it was visible to everyone. Religious infraction cases. Religion played a massive role in punishments, particularly for heresy, blasphemy, or non-compliance. Public penance often involved walking barefoot, carrying candles, or wearing penitential garments. Excommunication was social and spiritual, denying participation in both life and afterlife. Offenders sometimes performed their rituals in front of the town during feasts or church gatherings. These cases reinforced the church's authority while embedding moral lessons in daily life. The scold's bridle in action. Women accused of gossip or nagging weren't just punished, they were displayed. Scold's bridle or brank immobilized the tongue. Women might be paraded through town with bells, ensuring everyone could see and hear their humiliation. The device symbolized control, enforced conformity, and prevented repetitive offenses. Medieval authorities didn't just punish, they created memorable, symbolic lessons. Nobles and royal oddities. Not all legendary cases were about peasants. Nobles faced creative punishments too. Peter of Castile, known as Peter the Cruel, occasionally exiled nobles with elaborate conditions, forced marches, public apologies, or mock trials. Henry V sometimes fined or humiliated nobles for minor slights, turning punishment into spectacle at court banquets. Charles VI of France used isolation, absurd rituals, and psychological tactics to control his court without bloodshed. These cases show that even the powerful were subject to social and psychological discipline, albeit in a more luxurious setting. Public humiliation as a legacy. Many of these cases weren't just immediate punishments, they created stories. Villagers remembered who had sinned. Children learned lessons by observation. Gossip spread, ensuring compliance even in the absence of law enforcement. Punishment wasn't just about the individual. It was about shaping collective behavior. Medieval societies depended on memory, shame, and spectacle to maintain order. Closing thoughts for tonight. As we drift further into the candlelit streets of history, you can see a pattern. Medieval punishment combined pain, shame, and theatre. Minor offenders faced public ridicule. Guild members, peasants, and townspeople learned through observation. Nobles and kings navigated power through psychological and symbolic punishments. Pain was optional. Humiliation was permanent. The system worked because humans are social creatures, and medieval societies understood that visibility and memory often mattered more than steel or fire. Next time, in Part 10, we'll conclude with reflections on medieval justice as a social system, how humour, creativity, and ritual created compliance, and why these lessons still fascinate us today. Part 10. Reflections on a Cruelly Creative Age. Hey again, if you're still awake, well done. You've made it through an hour and a half of medieval weirdness, filled with dunking stools, scolds' bridles, and the occasional pig on trial. At this point, you've either drifted off, or you're quietly wondering how humanity made it out of the Middle Ages with any dignity left. Either way, let's bring this long, drowsy journey to a close. The philosophy behind the punishment. When we look at medieval punishments now, it's easy to see them as barbaric. People were whipped, branded, humiliated, even executed for crimes that today might earn a fine. But to the people living then, these punishments weren't just about cruelty. They were a moral language. Punishment wasn't meant to rehabilitate, it was meant to balance. Crime had disturbed the cosmic order, so something visible had to happen to restore it. And visibility was everything. If no one saw justice done, it didn't count. That's why gallows were placed on hills, why stocks sat in the centre of town, why confessions were public, and why even the smallest offences were turned into performances. Medieval punishment wasn't just law, it was theatre. The role of shame was the medieval equivalent of social media outrage. It worked fast, spread wide, and hit where it hurt most. The reputation, a person's name and honour were everything. Lose those, and you lost your livelihood, your community, your friends. So, being paraded through the streets in a barrel, or forced to wear a sign announcing your sin, wasn't just funny, it was devastating. In a way, the medieval world mastered the concept of cancel culture long before hashtags existed. The power of spectacle. You couldn't just quietly punish someone in private, the public needed to see, the church needed to bless it, and the crowd needed to learn from it. Every hanging, whipping, or ritualized shaming had an audience. The more elaborate the performance, the more it reinforced the message that justice was real and the world was in order. It wasn't only fear that kept people in line, it was participation. Everyone was part of the process, watching, judging, whispering, remembering. The spectacle was as much a social glue as it was a deterrent. The strange fairness of it, all as bizarre as some of these punishments were, they were surprisingly consistent. Everyone, from peasant to priest, could find themselves at the mercy of public opinion. Sure, nobles got lighter sentences, but they still had to face humiliation. Kings might not be dunked in rivers, but they endured exile, ridicule, or symbolic atonement. In a society obsessed with divine order, punishment wasn't supposed to discriminate too much. That said, the church and the crown always found ways to make sure the scales leaned in their favor. Some traditions, after all, never die. The decline of painful justice. By the late Middle Ages, things began to change. Philosophers, theologians, and early humanists started asking, does pain actually make people good? Turns out, not really. Torture and spectacle created fear, but not morality. The Renaissance gradually replaced divine terror with civic order. Prisons replaced public squares. Paperwork replaced whips. The Enlightenment went even further, treating punishment as a rational science. No more shame parades, just bureaucratic sentencing. Justice became private, quiet, and ironically, far less interesting. Echoes in modern times, of course. Medieval-style justice never fully disappeared. We just modernized it. Today, the courtroom replaced the market square. Social media replaced the stocks. Public shaming still happens. It's just digital now. And while we no longer force people into barrels, we do destroy reputations, record everything, and circulate it endlessly. Different tools, same instincts. Humans never stop needing to witness justice. We just change the stage, a quiet epilogue. If you close your eyes now, imagine those cobblestone streets again. It's twilight. The crowd is gone. The gallows are empty. The stocks stand unused, damp from rain. Somewhere, a guard snores near a dying torch. A baker cleans his shop. A priest whispers a prayer. And a rat sneaks through the marketplace. The day's punishments are over, but the memory lingers, faint and echoing like a warning that the world only stays orderly when everyone agrees to pretend it is. That's the real secret of medieval justice. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about cooperation through fear, fragile system of obedience built on shame, ritual, and the faint hope that no one would ever notice your own small sins. One last thought before you sleep if you've made it this far. You've wandered through 1,000 years of strange laws and stranger logic. We've met kings with creative tempers, peasants with bad luck, pigs with legal counsel, and towns that turned punishment into performance art. And through all of it, the message stayed the same. Justice is never just about right and wrong. It's about what a society needs to believe in to keep functioning. So, as the fire fades and the last echo of the town crier's bell disappears into the dark, maybe it's time to rest your mind. The Middle Ages were cruel, but also deeply human, messy, symbolic, theatrical, and oddly familiar, because even now, centuries later, we still live by stories of guilt and redemption, just with better plumbing and fewer gallows. Thanks for staying through this sleepy journey. I hope your eyelids are heavy, your room is quiet, and your dreams tonight are free of iron maidens, dunking stools or talking pigs in court. Good night, traveller of time. You've survived medieval justice, and that's more than most people could say back then.